Good afternoon, everybody. Like I said, my name is Phil Osborn. Hope everybody's had a good conference. I've seen what I've seen this morning. It was very enjoyable for me, so I hope you had a good time. We were able to hook up with classmates and alumnus. I'm sorry. I can walk away from the microphone here. Like I said, I'm a proud graduate of 070102, and the great work that this organization does and the classes and some of the work that comes out of here is something very to be proud of as a graduate. And I'm always speaking up highly of the program whenever I go teaching for Texas A&M and critical infrastructure programs. A lot of folks, especially a lot of emergency management folks in the class we teach, and we always try to speak up the program to get people to come in to apply, because I think it's a great opportunity for them. I want to thank Heather and the center for actually having me here to talk about something that's actually kind of near and dear to my heart, something I've been working on for over 2 decades. Right? Started out actually when I was at the National Program Manager for Cybercrime up in Washington, D.C., actually in Fairfax, Virginia, at the Cyber Smuggling Center. And it's something that I've lived in. It's sort of like the evolution of the border, right? And it's something like, how many people here are border people, border agents? Nobody, probably some of you who's left. I know there was one Border Patrol person. How many people here are the electronic crime people, or are the IT people for your organization? Still nobody, okay? What about any lawyers? Okay, there's one person in the back put his hand up, okay? Before your head explodes when I talk about the cyber border and things like that, a lot of what we worked on, I actually worked with our principal legal people up in Washington for a while on this thing, right? To actually, this concept of a national cyber border actually went all the way up to Capitol Hill. And it was actually being looked at very hard by the House Special Committee on Investigations, things like that. So it's not something that was, at the time, it was kind of exotic when we were working on it. Matter of fact, I almost did it as my master's thesis when I came here and started in 2005. But I ended up choosing something else that was a little bit more on the money laundering side, having to do with like cryptocurrencies and prepaid cards and terrorist financing, which was a little bit more in the forefront at the time. A little bit less exotic. Now I think the idea of a national cyber border, the time has come. People are a lot more attuned to high tech and understanding the internet and the threats, that right now it's like something it's something that was exotic at the time, but I think its time has actually come now, right? We have to evolve our idea and our concept of what the border is, right? But I'll give you as a sort of an example. I kind of gave it a similar example when I was talking about going after prepaid cards and all these new kind of financial systems that were out there, is that it's going to start out like a bad joke at a bar. 2 guys walk into a bar, but instead of being that, you have 2 guys, right? One guy comes walking up to customs, and he's carrying a camera or his laptop with him, and he presents himself to customs. They search his devices, and they find child pornography, okay? Guy gets arrested. He gets charged with smuggling. He gets charged with child exploitation laws, things like that. That same person, right? Instead of actually showing up at the border inspection, coming in from a foreign country with the child pornography on his device, let's say he's sitting there in Thailand, or he's sitting there in whatever country he's coming from. He takes all the pictures of all the child pornography that he produced while he was there, and he emails himself to his email account in the United States. Is he still broken the law? He's made a border crossing, right? He's smuggling. He actually imported something contrary to law. But when you actually look at the definitions of what merchandise is, what an importation is, things like that, it becomes kind of gray. So instead of being able to actually search his devices at the border without a warrant under Border Search Authority, we end up having to get a search warrant to do his email account. Okay? Now, normally sometimes it doesn't really matter, but when there's time constraints involved and people can destroy evidence, why can't we just go there and search that account where he imported that stuff, just like we would if he was coming across the border? He did the same thing. He imported something contrary to law, right? What about the reverse? Because when you talk about border inspection, it goes both ways. We can expect you leaving the country as well, right? So here's another guy. He's an insider. Let's say he works at a high-tech company that does military, has military contracts. He's got a thumb drive on him. A thumb drive with information which is sensitive, which would be subject to export controls, and you need licenses to export that information. He's carrying his device with him. He goes to the port. He's leaving the country. He gets stopped. They search that, and they find all this export-controlled information on him, right? That same person, instead of tearing on a thumb drive, he just emails it out of the country. Has he broken the law? Of course he's broken the law. Yeah, but when it actually comes down to it, when you actually look at the statutes, say, okay, where's the thing? We can do a border search on him as he leaves with a device in his pocket. But when he emails it out to a server, he's doing the same thing. He's exporting this information even quicker than he would normally, right? So those is just food for thought, right? That you have to sort of evolve the idea of what the border is in your mind. Okay, I've been living this in my entire life, right? Since I started out in the Coast Guard and then running boats for Customs for 20 years, I was either on the land border or I was on the sea border, chasing smugglers around. Then when I got into computer crime and ended up going in that path in my career, I ended up doing the same thing, except now I was actually trying to interpret the border when it came to cyberspace, right? So I guess that logo right there is over 30 years old, right? And I took it off of a hat that I have. Right? I actually took the picture. If you actually look at it, you know it's 30 years old because how many people have had a cathode ray tube monitor surfing on top of an IBM PC box on a surfboard surfing the internet? But look at the term underneath it, cyber smuggling. So 30 years ago, we were already at Customs. We were looking. We were actually working cases before. How many people here have had an email address since 1994? Very few people. And if you did, you probably had it because you were part of an academic or something like that, an institution. Most people, the internet itself wasn't even open to commercial traffic until like 96 or 97. Right? So most people didn't have email addresses, but we were working cyber, I would say cyber because it was computer-based child pornography cases and other types of cases before the internet was even, like people even knew it was ARPANET still, right? We were working computer bulletin board cases that people were running computer bulletin boards over in Europe and people in the United States were dialing into them in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So that's how long we've actually been doing this stuff. So when we came up with that term, cyber smuggling, we were already looking at the idea that when people are using stuff to move things across the border via the internet or via computer, that it was still smuggling, that these laws still applied, right? So what is this presentation? This presentation is the argument, right? The defining and defending of cyber border is critical to national security and homeland security, right? And that I'm going to offer one framework of how it can be done. This is not all the frameworks, right? Because it's a very complex subject. It's complex. When you think about border security, what do you think? Right? When I was running the boats or when I was on the border in the border patrol, you get what they call it, gates, guns, and guards. You have physical things where you're running around. Border security is physical things where you're causing people to go through inspections, where you're being able to search and look for what? Why do we even have borders? We have borders because it's part of national security. It's part of national sovereignty that you have a border, right? But when you think about defending a border, it's more than just regulations and law enforcement. The border is also national defense, right? So when you think about the land border, right? The land border is easy to conceptualize. You're standing in Mexico. I used to do that in the border patrol. You're standing in Mexico, now you're standing in the United States. Because back down in Chula Vista, when I was there in the border patrol, there wasn't any fence there in some places. You could literally step across the border and walk on one side to the other. So you have a physical land border. What's the air border? The air border is the extension of that up to outer space or wherever we decide where it's going to be. That's your air border, right? What about the sea border? Right? Now that's a little more complicated. Right? When I first started out in the Coast Guard in the early days of Customs, the territorial sea was 3 miles. And then in 1988, they extended it to 12 miles. And then you have like customs waters, contiguous zones, went out from when it was 3 miles, it was out to 9 to 12 miles was customs waters. And then you had a 200-mile fishery zone, right? Those things adapted over time. Does anybody here have an idea, unless you read my paper, right? Where they came up with 3 miles as the territorial sea, right? There's a term called the cannon shot rule. They came up, the Dutch first came up with the idea of being able to exercise control over the sea outside from land, right? Based on, for fisheries purposes, back in the 1600s, And then it wasn't until the 1702 or the early 1700s that actually a Dutch jurist said, look, you ought to be able to extend out and exercise control over the territory out in the ocean as far as a cannon shot can go. And then it was actually an Italian who actually measured. He went and he said, what's the most advanced cannons we have in the world right now? And he says it would shoot 3 miles. So that's where they came up with the idea of a 3-mile limit, right? And then over time, of course, it didn't take long before cannons were shooting way more than 3 miles. But they didn't change that until 1988 in the United States that we were going to exercise territorial control out to 12 miles. The whole reason I'm going over that is because it's adapted over time for various reasons, right? The technology of the day back in the 1700s was a cannon shot at 3 miles. The technology of the day now, this thing go out? Okay. The technology of the day now is when we think about the border, you have to start thinking about the evolving. You're going to have to evolve what you think about the border. Just like they evolved it with cannon shot, we got to evolve what our idea of the border is for cyber. Because what threats, I mean, you've probably sat through a bunch of during your classes and some of these presentations about just what the threats are that are coming from cyber. How many people here are in the health industry, or in that health sector, right? As I was sitting here during one of the presentations, my phone went off, and it was one of my people telling me that the University of Mississippi Medical Center had a cyber attack today, and it shut down the entire system. They had to cancel surgeries. They had to close all their 32 clinics, 10,000 employees, 70,000 patients. Everything stopped because of a cyber attack. Now, if that person was if that cyber attack was probably some kind of a ransomware attack, anybody heard of Colonial Pipeline, right? The Colonial Pipeline attack, that started out as a ransomware attack that hit their IT systems, and they shut down on purpose the OT and shut down the pipeline because they were worried about it actually migrating to it. So you have now when we look at that ransomware attack that just hit the Mississippi, right? If that was a foreign actor that did that and they're doing that directly, that's literally a foreign attack on a critical infrastructure sector. I work in the electrical sector, right? I'm the gloom and doom guy that does all the threat intelligence for things, right? But also what I'm doing, I'm identifying all the threats that are coming from foreign, all the what they call them, indicators of compromise, and I'm feeding that to all of our network people. We're already defending our own borders. When you think about it, evolving the idea of border protection, right? Right now, when it comes to the internet and critical infrastructure, who's in charge of protecting the electrical sector at my company? You're looking at them, right? Because what it is we're in charge of I did it last couple weeks. We updated the list of countries and IP addresses and IP blocks of foreign places that we don't want anything to be able to come into our network on. So I basically identified all these countries that we said, based on intelligence, here's the IP blocks, here's the top-level domains, gave it to the network people, they blocked it. We are literally the border protection for the electrical grid. And so to be honest, to be true, we get information from CISA, we get information from our intelligence partners and stuff saying, watch out for this, here's an indicator of compromise. What's interesting about this, for them to be able to give me an indicator of compromise to look out for something, that means somebody else got hit by it already. So it's already after the fact. Here's a list of bad IP addresses. How do we know? Oh, because that company got screwed by them last week, or they got their system compromised, they got a ransomware attack, something hit them, right? So we're in charge of that. Is that what you want to do for my paper? Is that the way we'd want to do border security at the border for, let's say, land border? Turn over border security in the physical land situation to the private landowners across the border. You wouldn't do that because the government has a duty and the government has an obligation to protect its frontier and its border. Why don't we do that same thing in cyber? And that's the whole gist of this thing, right? Is the time has come. It doesn't have to be that the government takes over. We're not talking about like all the different ways you can do it and the Great Wall of China and stopping people from talking and things like that. We're talking about a barrier or something, maybe a layered defense where it's private sector and government together, where maybe there's something has to go through a government filter first before it can actually get into our country. So yeah, we're always going to protect our own network, but maybe it's a matter of the government taking a much larger role, which they should do in a traditional sense, of protecting the border. And in this case, it's the cyber border. And in the end, when you talk about it, I live at the convergence, the apex, pardon the pun, of physical and cyber convergence, right? When somebody hits our power grid, if they do a cyber attack that takes down our OT systems and ends up like locking us up like it's happened over in Ukraine, and it's happened other places, then that is going to be a physical impact, right? We've got 7 million customers in our service area, and some of those customers are not just one person, they're in huge data centers and things like that. So you're talking literally the impact, and military bases, the impact on the country for us being hit with a cyber attack and shutting down the grid would be massive. During winter storms, people are going to die, right? So there's a physical impact to cyber. So you all know about convergence. I'm talking about we need to use that same idea about convergence when it comes to the cyber border versus the physical border, right? So it's not every how, right? I'm going to talk about the whys we want to do it, and I've already done that, but it's the how. It's like not every how. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. There's different ways we want to do it from a national defense perspective. There's different ways we want to do it from a law enforcement and regulatory perspective, and there's ways we want to do it from a critical infrastructure protection perspective, right? But it takes a lot of people. It takes everybody, like everybody represented in this room probably from your sectors working on it together. Right, the why. Like I already talked, borders define sovereignty, right? Without borders, you really don't have a country. You have, okay, people like the idea, on the internet, is there any, are there any borders in cyberspace? Yeah, there are. Like I said, if I ask how many people here are cyber people or information technology people, right? The entire language of networking on the computer talks about borders. You talk about border routers, you talk about firewalls, you're talking about gateways, you're talking about literally demarcation lines from one network to the next, right? So the whole idea, if you've got borders in cyberspace, then you've got borders in cyberspace. You've got borders in IT, you've got borders, right? And when people are trying to say, there's a lot of people that would have questions about what if this, what if that. I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but the strategy will dictate the tactics, right? We have to decide that we are going to actually have a strategy that says we have a national cyber border and we have the authority to protect it. And this is how we do that. And that's going to change over time. As technology is going to change, as things happen, and fill in the blank. Some disruptive technology on the internet comes up that might make what we're doing as some type of a defense or border protection or border control on the internet changes, then that's going to have to adapt as well. It's already happened. As we've worked cases over, even since I was doing it, right? Having to do with Tor. Everybody knows the onion router, right? Did you know who invented that? The United States Navy. So that people can communicate. But people don't realize that the onion router is nothing more than something that was actually conceived of 10 years earlier, called using anonymous remailers, which use layers like onion routers to actually move data across anonymously from one country, one person to another. And we actually went to MIT and we actually went to some people back in the early days and figured it out. And there was literally, we could have figured it out overnight by doing that. It's just a matter of being able to here's a problem and this is how we address it. But anyway, borders define sovereignty of a country, right? You can't have a country without borders, right? And it's bad form to quote yourself, but that's a quote from me that I've been using for years. And I used it when I wrote up the original draft that went up to Capitol Hill back in 2005 to actually say we need to have a cyber border. The border is where transnational threats become domestic realities. That top line up there where cyberspace is now the front line, that was from about 2 weeks ago up in Capitol Hill in a hearing that they were talking about foreign threats. So it's not anything exotic anymore to think that that everybody knows about the threats in cyber. It's a matter of what we're going to do about it. And one of them is we can defend, because what do you have a border for? Borders are to control what and who comes across. And that goes in both directions, right? And it's not just illegal stuff, right? Borders originally, when the original border search authority actually predates the Fourth Amendment, right? Border Search Authority and the U.S. Customs Service was established in 1789 by George Washington. It was signed into law, one of the first acts of Congress was to create the Customs Service and actually have a border search authority to be able to search stuff, right? 1790, they created the Revenue Cutter Service, right, which is the predecessor of the Coast Guard, to actually being able to go out there, identify people smuggling, trying to avoid tariffs and paying duties on stuff, right? The major thing when I came in Customs, I said, what's your mission? Is to protect the revenue. Protect the revenue, right? But, collecting duties and stuff, people are trying to smuggle in and stuff. So we're trying to control what's coming across, not just to collect duty, but also prevent illegal things from coming in. Not just the obvious stuff like child porn. What about agricultural inspection? When you're actually trying to stop people bringing in something that may have some type of diseased plant or some type of food that's going to end up impacting our food supply. So the border is where you actually have a chance and you actually can control what comes across and who comes across. Right? So that's where, because if you can stop it, if we could have stopped the 9/11 guys from coming in, we wouldn't have had 9/11, right? If we can stop anything, if we can stop that same thing on a cyber attack, that keeps it, somebody from trying to take down the power grid. Right? And like I said, the question is isn't whether there's borders existing in the cyberspace. Yes, they do. They certainly do, right? You've got physical borders where the actual data transmission lines come across, right? And people from probably some folks that might know, that raise their hand about having an email address back in the old days. It used to be back in the early 90s, all the internet traffic in the world used to go through 4 network access points in the United States. And 3 or 4 metropolitan area exchanges, they call them. These were basically peering points that big internet service providers, today is Sprint and IBM and people that had these big networks. Literally everything would go through there, right? So it's not a question whether those borders exist. You can actually sit there and watch all the traffic going back and forth. So you have physical lines that come across the border, right? But you also have something important we'll talk about in a second, right? Which is called functional equivalence of the border, right? Really strictly speaking, the best analogy I use is for airplanes, right? Before you had airplanes, most time when you're customs, you're either standing on the border stopping somebody, or you're out on a ship stopping somebody to search and see if they had anything that needed to be for duty on and stuff. Now that now you have, when you had aircraft, you have an airplane that can fly across the border and land in the interior of the United States. Well, unless you have a customs guy on the plane searching people at 35,000 feet as they come across, right? What's your option? Your option is to search that plane at the first available place that actually lands, where it's able to be inspected. That's basically a functional equivalent of the border, right? So, but you have these different ways you can actually look at the border, and using this, and I'll get more into the customs perspective in a second with a few little graphics to sort of demonstrate it to you. But like I said, we already talked about cyber crimes. They're fundamentally altering the landscape of Homeland Security and national security. And that includes, that we need to evolve our concept of the border to include the cyber domain. By defining a border, we can actually come up, talking about the tactics. Because people are going to sit there and say, well, what about this, what about this, what about that? We can't even have that conversation until we have a strategy that says, yes, we have a cyber border, we have the ability to protect it, and we have the right and the obligation to protect it, and this is how we're going to do it. Then we can start answering all those what-if questions, all the tactics, how you do it, and how you decide how you want privacy protections. All that can be addressed as we normally address things, but the first thing you have to do is you have to say, yes, there is a cyber border to the United States, and we have the right and the authority and the ability to protect it. And like I said, this is me talking right here. It's not academic. It's a strategic necessity, right? Cyber is the prelude to every attack now. We're doing it before we attack somebody, right? The first shot is not going to be kinetic. The first shot is going to be something where they try to take down our critical infrastructure, and they're going to take it down using some cyber tactic. If you live in the world of cyber threats, right, you know about APTs, advanced persistent threats, right? You know about Volt Typhoon. The Chinese have been in the power grid, and they've been dwelling there for years, waiting. Why are they waiting? They're not sitting there. Some of it is spying, but a lot of it is they're just waiting for the opportunity when they need to use that first shot, the cyber shot against us, and then they're going to follow with kinetic. We do it ourselves. We've done it before. We've been doing it for years, right? If you remember the first Gulf War, the first thing they did was shoot like Mylar strips over Baghdad to take out the power grid. Well, that was not a cyber attack, but now they can do that same thing using a cyber method. They don't have to send a plane over there to try to take out the power grid. I like that the bottom part is right. We need to recognize that we have a cyber border. We need to define it, and then we need to defend it. All right, here's the how. This is where we spent a lot of our effort actually coming up with ways that we could actually conceptualize and be able to use existing authorities. Because I mean, think about this. I even proposed in one of the things I wrote up there that we have a choice. We either adapt our laws, just like we always have done when it comes to case law and things like that, to address like a new disruptive type of thing or something new, or we create new law. Creating new law might be dirtier, or it might be harder to create a law, right? I even said that instead of like adapting customs laws and changing and amending customs laws to talk about cyber, maybe that won't work in the end. Maybe it'll work for one perspective, but it might not work for everything, right? So what we're talking about is maybe we need an entire new U.S. code. Maybe we need to have U.S. Code 55 or whatever one's open and say, look, that's cyber. That's the cyber code of the U.S. Code, talking about regulations. You have adjoining CFRs, all that stuff, just to address all the different things of cyber. Because I mean, that's all we do. That's what we've been doing for 30 years. That I've been doing cyber investigations, right? Is that we take an existing law and we say, okay, well, here's something new. They're doing it cyber. Here's kiddie porn. Kiddie porn used to be, what's the definition of kiddie porn? Definition of kiddie porn used to be all like photographs, undeveloped film, video, blah, 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 blah. Never said anything about computer images. So what do? We said, well, we'll just amend that law and say, okay, including computer images. And then they say, well, what about like AI and computer-generated images? And then we say, well, what about we change the language to say any image which is indistinguishable from a real child engaged in sexually explicit conduct, right? So we've been adapting laws. The law the regulation and the power that Customs is using to search your data at the border on your laptop or your phone, when you actually look coming out of the Ninth Circuit and the decision how they decided that was legal to do was based on saying, okay, there's no difference between your laptop and if this person literally came walking up and they had a dolly and they had a filing cabinet on it. Right? You should be able to search that laptop just like you're searching those files, right? And how do you protect private communications? Well, I can scan documents just to see, because documents are one thing that you can actually look at too. Documents which are associated with an importation or an exportation are also subject to search. So I can look at that, I can scan a document, I can scan your entire computer, and all I'm looking for, I'm not looking for personal communications, I'm looking for something that looks like, oh, here's an invoice. Here's a document. I just can scan it long enough until I can decide whether that is something that has to do with the importation or not, right? So that's what they did. They adapted customs laws. I'm talking about the same thing. I've been talking about it for years, is just adapting existing customs law and say, okay, including cyber, right? Cyber border defined. I talked about functional equivalence of the border. The first practical inspection point. So whether or not, if it's coming down from satellite or it's coming across a wire or it's coming in beamed in by microwave, whatever that data stream is, the first place it hits in the United States that you are able to do an inspection of that data, that's the functional equivalent of the border. Just like if a plane's flying from Israel to New York, right? You don't inspect it as it comes across the international border at 12 miles now. You end up searching it at the customs, at the port of entry, or where it lands, the international port of entry, where it lands. If it lands in New York, you do a customs inspection there. If it lands in Missouri, you do a customs inspection there. That's the essence of the functional equivalent of the border, right? Then you have another thing, a little bit more complicated, and you talk about what you need to show. There's a thing called an extended border. Right, and I'll show you what an extended border looks like on the slide that actually shows you how this would work in real life. But an extended border is basically places away from the border or beyond the functional equivalent of the border where it actually whatever that data is, it takes the border with it. And the only caveat is for me to be able to do a warrantless custom search at a FEB. I don't have to have any suspicion. At the functional equivalent border or at the border, you have to have no suspicion. You don't have to have reasonable suspicion, not probable cause, nothing. Just the fact that you're there at the functional equivalent border, we can actually do a warrantless search for merchandise and for anything that's illegally being imported contrary to law. The extended border is even beyond that, right? So if it comes in FedEx, it gets to you, and we find out later on, we find out that there might be something illegal, we can actually follow that package where it goes. As long as we can show that there's some type of reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, that border goes with that package. So when you think about package, instead of thinking about physical package, now think about datagrams. Think about data files and things like that. Right? The whole idea about that is the legal framework. We're leveraging what is probably the most accepted exception to the Fourth Amendment. Like I said, it's been around, Border Search Authority has been around longer than the Fourth Amendment. Fourth Amendment was ratified in 1781, 2 years after the Customs Service was created and Border Search Authority was granted. Because you have to have that. You can't have to get a warrant at the border for every time you want to search something. Has anybody ever heard of the name Kiki Camarena? Who is it? Right. Kiki Camarena was a DEA agent who was tortured and murdered by the cartels back in 1985. Right? In answer to that, they were trying to get the Mexicans to get these guys and cooperate in apprehending these people, right? The commissioner at the customs, his name was William Von Raab, right? Cool little guy, right? He basically said, okay, they're not going to cooperate. This is what we're going to do. We're going to have 100% inspection of every vehicle that comes across the border. Because we don't do that now. It's a risk-based approach now. You don't search everybody that comes across the border. If you've come through customs, they didn't toss all your stuff every time they came through. They may have asked you a few questions, see where you're coming from, maybe ask you a few things, but you didn't get like a full-blown customs inspection. When you come across the border with your car, they didn't send you to secondary and rip the seats out, right? But they were going to do we're going to do a 100% inspection of all vehicles coming across the border. What do you think happened in really short order? It had traffic jams going miles and miles into Mexico, shut everything down. Not only just regular commerce, but all commerce. Shut everything down. And don't you think that the Mexicans came to the table and started cooperating and catching these guys? Because it shut literally everything down by doing 100% inspection. You don't do 100% inspection, but you have the authority to do that if you want. And then the flip side of that was, the rumor was Ronald Reagan called William Von Raab up and said, hey, great job, but next time you declare war on Mexico, let me know. Right? So it was always kind of a cool thing. But that's how you did it. And you had that leverage if you want, right? When you talk about extending the authority for warrantless inspection in cyberspace to what are functional equivalents of the border and extended borders, right? Talking about data. We're talking about data which is tied to imports, exports, and illicit trade. We're not talking about personal communications. Because most people, when you're going to be reading everybody's email and yada yada and all this stuff and all these. What about the privacy protections and stuff? We're not talking about reading your email. We're not talking about personal communications. We're talking about data, which is the equivalent of merchandise. There's a lot of things that are merchandise. People say, you don't think that the people that own software companies and people that have music companies and movie companies, you don't think that that's not merchandise to them, and that can't be transferred over the internet? And what about illegal stuff, child pornography? When we created when the Cyber Smuggling Center became the Cyber Crime Center after 9/11, we changed the name from Cyber Smuggling. It was C3 then. We wanted to be able to, and I came up with the name. We're going to change the name. Okay, let's change it. Let's keep that C3 because we had so much stuff that said C3 on it. I said, I don't want to get rid of all that stuff, right? So we changed the name to the ICE Cyber Crime Center. And one of the things we did was we said, okay, now we're incorporating all this immigration stuff in. How do we make the case that immigration has a seat at the table for cyber? One of the first things I did was I spun up an operation to identify all the immigration threats that are on cyberspace. And what do you think? You can't beam somebody across like in the Enterprise, right, over the internet. But what about, we spent about 6 months, we were able to acquire every immigration document you can think of. We were able to get I was able to buy driver's licenses from all 50 states with the holograms on them, in any name I wanted. I can get green cards. I could get passports in every country. All these documents which would allow somebody to circumvent immigration controls. Not just people that just want to come in for a better life. How about terrorists? Right, so all that was just like in real short order, right? We're talking about the data. We're not talking about the communications. Now, one thing, the caveat is, like I said, is that merchandise also includes the documents having to do with an importation or exportation. So we can scan documents looking for, you can look through documents. Does this have to do with an importation? Is this an order for a counterfeit passport that this person is sending out, right? And I'll show you, in the next slide, you'll see how that works. And the reason I'm showing you, I'll show you that graphic, because this is exactly how it worked when I did all the cases, was identifying where it's coming from and locations or where files are and where documents having tied to illegal importations and tied to exportations, you name it, right? But we're not talking about, so when you're talking about privacy concerns, we're not talking about reading people's email. We're not talking about reading people's, if we're talking about people's email and people were worried about it, I said, well, how about this? Just if you're in law enforcement, you're familiar with the taint team, right? When you're looking at evidence, you have somebody else look at the evidence so that you don't taint your case and stuff like that, or minimization in Title IIIs. You could use AI. Things that didn't exist back when I was writing this thing. I said, how are we going to look through and identify if these are personal communications or if they have to do with some type of an importation? So we'll use AI. AI can scan it and look at it, and if it comes up, if it identifies that, yes, this looks like it might be to do with importation or some type of illegal activity, then we look at that. But we don't look at everybody's even. We couldn't do it anyway. But it's just one way. Certain things, when I wrote this originally back in 2005, the proposition for this, we didn't have AI for doing stuff. Now we do. That may actually solve a lot of problems that we were thinking about we were going to have at the time that didn't exist. The solution didn't exist then, right? Like the focus, right, is on data related to imports, and the export of merchandise, right? Part of it was actually just sort of changing legal definitions. We wanted three things when it comes to customs laws, right, to be able to do this. And one of them was, one of the primary ones, we wanted the functional equivalent of a border to actually be sort of a sense of Congress, if not an actual update to the law, was that the functional equivalent border also includes cyber borders. The concept of functional equivalent of border and extended borders also applied to customs, right? Or applied to the border search and the border domain, the cyber border domain, right? Another one was we wanted to have a definition of merchandise. The actual definition, if you look at some of the definition of merchandise, it's kind of like leftover. If you read the border search story, they're talking about searching mules. That's how old that is. They're talking about vehicles. They're talking about vehicles, mules, ships, and all this, which you can search, right? My idea would be, okay, not only do you change the definition of what can be searched to like maybe even include the idea of data streams is that. If the vehicle for me to transport something used to be on a mule back, or it used to be on a container, or it used to be in a package or a box as they say in the law, right? Maybe the next one has to be, okay, also in datagram packets, right? But with the original language, what we wanted was just the definition of merchandise, whether it's legal or illegal, also to include cyber-delivered merchandise and data. And the other one was, if anybody, like the lawyers in the room, right, was that there's the law that controlled what we did, right, when it came to getting records and stuff from internet service providers, is called the ECPA, the Electronic Communication Privacy Act, right? We wanted an amendment to the ECPA that literally said that the warrantless border search requirement also applied, that was an exception to the warrant requirement under the ECPA was for border search situations. And that's what we were asking for. Now that might have been, and you think, well, that's a kind of not exactly. That may have been the one where we may have had the hardest time, but I don't think so. Because we've already changed the ECBA, right? After 9/11, I got a phone call. I'm sitting there, I get a phone call from Justice, because I used to sit on a lot of panels for undercover stuff on the internet. They said, hey, we're working on this law. It's called the Patriot Act. What would you like to see in it? And I'm sitting there going, Well, I looked at the ECBA, and one of the things we always had a problem with is under the ECBA, when you wanted to get I wanted to find out about a particular internet account that was doing something illegal, right? I would have to I could use a custom summons, so that's another nod to the legal world, that we were already looking at stuff going on the internet as a customs violation. We were using customs administrative summonses, not court orders, not search warrants, right? Not national security letters. We were using custom summonses, and custom summonses could be signed by my special agent in charge. We used to have stacks of them, right? Send those over to an internet service provider like Hotmail, and we would get, okay, here's the subscriber, here's Joe Blow, his address, how long he's had the service. What I really wanted was, I wanted the IP addresses that person, every time that person logged into the Hotmail account, I wanted the IP address. Well, under the ECBA, it was kind of a gray area whether those were considered subscriber records or if that was considered what's called transactional records, right? So what I did was I said, look, what I would like to see in the Patriot Act is I would like to see that subscriber records also include temporarily assigned IP addresses. And just based on that went in there and it went through, and it doesn't sunset. That's not one of the parts of the ECBA or the Patriot Act that sunsetted, right? Was actually that. So we can do that. We can already change and get these things amended. Hopefully, it won't take another 9/11 before we can get something changed where we can apply customs authorities, at least one solution for protecting the cyber border by adapting customs authorities. It won't take some type of event like a 9/11 before we can actually get that in there. There's also other stuff that we put in the Patriot Act. Like I said, why should we have to get a search warrant? Every time somebody wants to do, I'm showing my age, American Online account, before 9/11, if you want to do a search warrant on an American Online account, you literally had to go to the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office or get with the feds up there. They would have to swear out the warrant because where is American Online located? In Northern Virginia, right? We got the law changed for electronic records and electronic searches that any court of competent jurisdiction should actually write the warrant. So you didn't actually have to go to that particular district to get the warrant. You could have a warrant sworn out in Washington that would work at Hotmail in San Jose, right? That was our thing. So we can change things. We have adapted them, right? Like I said, it was like at the time when the Patriot Act was being written, everybody was literally, everybody wanted to do whatever they could to prevent another 9/11, right? So, but that's what we're talking about. But privacy concerns are something that people worry about. And you say, look, there's privacy concerns at the border too. When you're at the physical border, right? Yeah, we can search you. We can do a border search on you. But when it becomes a non-routine search, where we're going to strip search you and do all sorts of stuff like that, then we have to have some suspicion. We never have to have probable cause. At least as far as I know, that's never reaches that level where you have to have probable cause to do searches. Even though we probably would, if it got to where we were doing something where we're actually doing x-rays on people to find out if they had something in their stomach and things like that, but we don't have to. All right, and this is where sort of kind of a graphic that I wanted to show you there, is that and this is a perfect example because I've worked cases like this, hundreds of cases like this, right? That's a website operator in Paris. He's sitting there, Pepe Le Pew. He's in Paris. He's running a website where he's selling child pornography, right? What he does, he doesn't want to have the website on an internet service provider in Paris or in France because he doesn't want to get arrested by his own people. So he goes and he opens up a website account. It's back then it was Houston because one of the bigger website hosting companies down in Texas was there, probably the largest of all websites at the time. He opens up an account with them, and that's where he's got his website. And then what he does, he uploads all this kiddie porn into directories, right? And then he advertises that on the internet. You go on there, and here's now the guy up in Duluth, right? He ends up going there, and he ends up going into, now, when I show you right there, it says the guy in Paris, when he uploads that stuff, that illegal material to that web server in Texas, that becomes a functional equivalent of the border. That's the first practical place that we would be able to inspect, right? Guy in Duluth, he may see advertisements. He may have met this guy online in some of the chat rooms and say, oh yeah, I got a website up or whatever. However we find out, he ends up going and paying. He may even go through email. The guy that has the web server, he has an email address, say it's a Hotmail address. I'll pick on them, right? He got a Hotmail address for orders. So now the guy in Duluth ends up emailing the guy in his Hotmail account, says, look, I want to buy XYZ, whatever. I want to have this many files or whatever. I want this particular child porn video or whatever it is, right? That conversation back and forth between I'm going to order this is how I'm going to do it, how am I going to pay for it. I haven't even thrown the payment system in. Payment system, well, let's say it's Bitcoin now, right? I'll take out for how many dollars in Bitcoin you can transfer, right? That throws even another thing into it that we might be able to talk about. Is actually going after the payment system, right? So now this guy in San Jose, that right there, depending on what he's doing, if the guy in the web server, let's say that he emails the child porn to the guy through his Hotmail account, that Hotmail account, if anything touches it in Paris, whether that could be either the child porn itself or documents, that becomes a functional equivalent of border. Because now you've got documents relating to an importation that the guy is going to be doing, right? And then all of a sudden the communication now between if the child porn goes directly from the web server to the guy in Duluth, that could be an extended border search. Where you could actually, where would you search? You literally search the guy's computer at his house. How would I find out about that? Because when I hit the internet service provider in Houston with either a summons, or even better, now that if it's functional equivalent of border, I want all the records. I want to know what they uploaded. I want to know what they downloaded. All the contents of this guy's home directory, they call it when you have a website, right? I can find out what exactly this guy ordered and when he ordered it, right? So now, in practicality, we might, depending on the urgency of it, we might just go and get a search warrant for the guy up in Duluth. But why on earth would I have to get a search warrant for this functional equivalent of border in Houston, where this guy directly, and I can hit them from, like I said, I can hit them with a summons. They would show that, okay, the guy logged in from Paris, here's the IP address, this is what he did, he created the account, this is how he paid for it with this. This is all of every IP address, this is all the file uploads he did. They're all coming from foreign. Why would we treat that any different than if that guy was literally crossing the border at the port of New York, at the airport at Kennedy, coming in with a briefcase or a laptop full of child porn? And then he sits at his computer at home, and then he uploads it to a web server someplace where he's selling it, right? So that right there is one scenario that shows you functional equivalence of the border and the extended border all in one slide. And then the last one, this one shows even, how about this? The guy in Duluth becomes a functional equivalent of the border. How does he do that? Because this is exactly a situation I've run into where the guy in Paris, he's got his website where he advertises the kiddie porn in Houston. He may have some there or not. He also is running all of his email through Hotmail, and it's to where all the orders and all the information about what people are ordering are going through the Hotmail address. He may, instead of when the guy in Duluth orders the child porn from the guy and pays for it, he may be given a web address over in Sweden. Or this is, depending on how, if he's using some type of a file sharing system or file download system, the IP address actually shows that it's actually coming from a website in Sweden. So now this guy in Duluth, he's directly downloading child porn from Sweden. So now his computer at home, that becomes a functional equivalent of the border. He's directly importing illegal material. All right, so that's all in one, where that guy in Duluth could be either a functional equivalent of the border or an extended border or both, depending on the situation. So I know in conclusion, right, I don't think we can secure our border, our nation without securing the cyber border. Too many things. There's too much convergence of physical and cyber threats, right? And a lot of these threats are coming from foreign. Like I said, I live in it every day, right? The ransomware as a service people, the APTs, they're all foreign actors. And they're, whether they're bouncing through proxy servers and stuff like that, they still got to come into the country somewhere from foreign, unless they have a foreign agent acting within the country. And if that's the case, they still got to get that information and data out. And that means it's going to be crossing the border at some point, going out or coming in. We cannot secure our nation without securing the cyber border. And that, the whole spiel I gave about customs, that's one way. of doing it. But we can define national cyber border, we can defend it a bunch of different ways. There's a lot of different ways to slice, to peel an apple, but we have to be able to define it first. You have to be able to define the border, and you have to say, look, that's a strategy. We're defining a national cyber border, and we do have the right and the ability and the authority and the duty to protect it. And it's call to action, right? It's time for this. I think it's the time has come for this thing. All this thing, day in and day out, 24 hours a day, I'm looking at all this threat intelligence coming in. Most of it, 99% of it, seems like it's all having to do with foreign actors doing something, whether it's criminals or it's state actors doing things, going after our critical infrastructure, waiting to do something bad, or is either war or is this some type of criminality, right? Is it defining and recognizing our cyber borders in law and policy, right? And that allows us to align all of our authorities. I can envision the authorities, resources, and agencies defend it. I can see in a cyber border situation, I'm even thinking like where Customs and ICE now or whatever, and CBP, they're in charge of the border and basically border protection and border security and border enforcement and stuff. That may have changed too. Other agencies have a stake in this as well. So maybe border search authority needs to be extended out to other people, right? How many people here know that the Coast Guard has border search authority? Coast Guard petty officers are customs officers as well, right? And there's a reason for that too, because when I was in the Coast Guard, there wasn't any customs down in the Florida Keys. So we were doing all the boardings and stuff like that, right? Our Coast Guard is already customs officers, right? But maybe we have, Cyber Command. Maybe Cyber Command, they've got obviously a big stake in protecting the nation on the cyber frontier, right? That's what they're there for. So Cyber Command, maybe there has to be a layered security kind of thing. Maybe it has to be customs. Maybe it's just like when you're coming into the country, you got kind of a national defense protection. Then you have border protection. And then even in the interior, then you have private sector. Private sector isn't going to have border search authority, but maybe the private sector is definitely a part of it, part of border security, right? What gets through the national, let's say, a firewall that maybe the military runs, and then gets through something that the civilian side does, right, on the customs side, when it finally gets to my network at our electric company, we've got a stake in border security too. We're protecting the border. We're literally stopping foreign actors every day, whether it's automated through our filtering on our firewalls or it's something that I see in an IOC and say, look, this is new, we need to stop this, right? We all have a stake in it. I think everybody does. Everybody's got a stake in it, right? Everybody knows about the community lifelines, right? Everybody knows about lifeline sectors. All those lifeline sectors, right? Water, electricity, we've already been targeted by foreign actors for whatever reason, whether it's ransomware or a malign state trying to take some action, right? So it's going to take everybody. It's going to take aligning policy and laws and authorities and resources and agencies to do it. It's complicated. No one says it's going to be easy, right? But just because something is difficult doesn't say you throw your hands up and say we can't do it. That's all I got.